Shadows of Greed, My Escape from Death. Part 2. Not long after that conversation, David's life took an abrupt turn. One day, he came home with a brand new car. At first, I thought he had borrowed it from someone, but when I asked him about it, he smiled and said, "It's mine." "How? Where did you get the money?" I asked, my voice full of disbelief. "I told you, Grace. Things are turning around for me. I've been working with some new people, and they've been helping me out." His explanation was vague, and I didn't believe him for a second. But before I could press further, he handed me a stack of cash. "Here, take this," he said. "Go treat yourself. Buy whatever you want." I stared at the money in my hand, a mixture of shock and confusion flooding my mind. This wasn't David. This wasn't the man I had struggled with for years, who had always been transparent about his struggles. Something was very wrong. Over the next few weeks, David's wealth grew exponentially. He was always buying new things, clothes, gadgets, even furniture for our small flat. He started taking me to fancy restaurants and showing me off to his new, flashy friends. But no matter how much money he spent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As David's sudden wealth grew, so did the distance between us. He was no longer the man I had fallen in love with, the humble, hard-working guy who had once shared his dreams with me. Now, it seemed like money was all that mattered to him, and I was beginning to see the cracks in our relationship. The more I questioned where his wealth was coming from, the more defensive he became. "Why are you always asking me these questions?" he snapped one evening, after I asked him again how he had come into so much money. "Isn't it enough that I'm providing for us? Don't you trust me?" It was a trap. If I admitted that I didn't trust him, it would lead to an argument. But if I said I did, I'd be lying. Something deep in my gut was screaming that this wasn't right, that David had gotten involved in something dark and dangerous. But I was afraid to confront the truth. That night, as he lay asleep, I found myself staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My thoughts were racing. Who was this man lying next to me? What had he become? And what was he willing to do to keep this newfound wealth? I felt trapped between my love for David and my fear of what he had become. Then, things started getting even stranger. I began to notice Victor lurking around our flat more often. He had always been a shadowy presence, but now, it seemed like he was always there, watching, waiting. Sometimes, I would catch him staring at me in a way that made my skin crawl, but whenever I mentioned it to David, he brushed it off. "Victor is harmless," David would say. "He's just looking out for me. You should be grateful to him." Grateful? I was anything but. Victor's presence made me feel uneasy, and I was beginning to see how deeply he had influenced David. The man I loved was slipping away, and I didn't know how to reach him. One night, I was alone in the flat while David was out with Victor. I had grown accustomed to these nights. David would disappear for hours, and I'd be left to wonder what he was doing. I tried to distract myself, but something felt different about that night. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of impending doom that I couldn't shake. I had just finished preparing dinner when my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Get out of the house. Now." My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the screen, unsure of what to make of the message. Was it a prank? A mistake? I couldn't tell. But something inside me urged me to take it seriously. I grabbed my keys and phone and hurried out of the flat, my mind racing. As I stepped into the cool night air, I looked around the compound. Everything seemed quiet, almost too quiet. I started walking toward the gate, planning to go to a friend's house until I could figure out what was going on. But just as I reached the gate, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw David, standing in the shadows, his eyes cold and distant. "Where are you going, Grace?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. I needed some air," I stammered, my heart pounding in my chest. "I was just going for a walk." He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You're lying. You're trying to leave, aren't you?" I shook my head, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I could see the anger rising in him, the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands clenched into fists. This wasn't the David I knew, this was someone else entirely. Before I could say anything else, Victor appeared behind him, a twisted smile on his face. "You should have stayed inside," Victor said, his voice dripping with malice. "It would have been easier that way." I didn't have time to react. David grabbed my arm and started dragging me back toward the flat. I struggled, but he was stronger than I remembered. The look in his eyes was terrifying, like he had become someone else entirely. Once inside the flat, David shoved me onto the couch. I tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but the words wouldn't come. My body was trembling with fear, and I could see Victor lurking in the corner, his presence more menacing than ever. "What are you doing, David?" I finally managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. David didn't answer. He paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair, as if battling with something inside him. But then Victor spoke, and his words sent a chill down my spine. "It's time, David," he said, his voice calm and measured. "You've done everything we've asked. Now you just need to complete the final step." I felt my blood run cold. The final step. What were they talking about? Victor turned to me, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You see, Grace, David here made a deal. He wanted wealth, and we gave it to him. But everything comes with a price. And unfortunately for you, you're part of that price." I froze, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was hearing. They had made a deal. And I was the price. "No!" David suddenly shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. I can't do it." Victor sighed, shaking his head. "You're too weak, David. I told you this would happen. That's why I'm here, to make sure you don't back out." Everything was happening so fast. David looked at me, his eyes filled with regret, but also something darker, something that terrified me. I knew in that moment that he had truly intended to go through with it. He had been willing to sacrifice me for his wealth. I bolted from the couch, trying to run for the door, but Victor was faster. He grabbed me by the arm and threw me to the ground, pinning me down with a strength that felt unnatural. "Stay still," he hissed. "It will be over soon." But I wasn't ready to give up. With every ounce of strength I had left, I fought back. I kicked and screamed, my body fueled by pure adrenaline. Victor was caught off guard, and for a brief moment, his grip loosened. I used that opportunity to break free, scrambling toward the door. David hesitated, standing frozen as if torn between saving me and completing the ritual. But I didn't wait to find out what he would decide. I flung the door open and ran, my feet pounding against the pavement as I sprinted toward the gate. I could hear Victor yelling behind me, his voice filled with fury. "Don't let her get away." But I didn't look back. I kept running, my heart pounding in my chest, the cold night air biting at my skin. I ran through the compound, out into the street, not stopping until I was far away from the flat,